The air in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., was thick and heavy, not just with the humid summer air, but with an unseen weight of tension and division. It was a city of whispers and worried glances where the very foundations of the American experiment seemed to tremble. Men in tall hats and dark coats strode through the halls of Congress, their faces grim, their words sharp and loaded like pistols. You could almost feel the heat of the arguments rising from the marbled floors, a constant low hum of conflict that had been building for decades. This wasn't a sudden storm, but the culmination of a long, slow gathering of thunderclouds on the horizon. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Then, feel free to share your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see just how far this story travels. The nation had, for many years, been a house divided, and the central splintering crack in its foundation was the institution of slavery. While the North had largely moved toward industrialization and a wage-based economy, the South remained deeply agrarian. Its economy was an intricate, sprawling tapestry woven with the threads of large plantations and the forced labor of millions of enslaved African Americans. This economic divergence created vastly different societies with opposing views on labor, freedom, and the very concept of human dignity. The North saw slavery as a moral blight and an economic anachronism, a system that held back progress and contradicted the nation's founding principles. They began to embrace the idea of free labor, where individuals could work for wages and theoretically rise through the ranks. In the South, however, slavery was seen not just as an economic necessity, but as a cornerstone of their entire way of life. It was a deeply ingrained social system, a complex hierarchy that shaped everything from politics to family life. Southern leaders argued that their society was more stable and civilized than the North's chaotic, competitive industrial world. They believed they were acting in a paternalistic role, caring for their enslaved population, a claim that seems utterly absurd to modern ears. But to them, it was a fundamental truth, and any challenge to it was a threat to their survival. This foundational difference led to decades of political skirmishes. The most significant battles were fought over the expansion of slavery into new territories. As the United States expanded westward, the question of whether a new state would enter the Union as free or slave became a matter of national importance. Each new state shifted the balance of power in Congress, and both sides fought tooth and nail to maintain their influence. This ongoing struggle resulted in a series of compromises, each one a temporary patch on a deepening fissure. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, for instance, drew a line across the country, allowing Missouri to enter as a slave state, while Maine came in as a free state and establishing a boundary for future expansion. It was a good faith effort to keep the peace, but it was really just putting a band-aid on a wound that needed stitches. The Compromise of 1850 was another such attempt, which included the controversial Fugitive Slave Act. This law was a victory for the South, requiring northern states to assist in the return of runaway enslaved people. For many Northerners who had previously been able to ignore the realities of slavery, this law brought the institution directly to their doorstep. The moral outrage was immediate and widespread. People who had never considered themselves abolitionists suddenly found themselves hiding freedom seekers in their homes or defying federal marshals. It was a legal move that, ironically, served only to strengthen the abolitionist cause. The publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in 1852 further inflamed Northern sentiment. The book's emotional and dramatic portrayal of the brutalities of slavery resonated with millions, transforming the abstract political debate into a deeply personal moral crusade. The South, of course, denounced the book as a pack of lies and a gross misrepresentation of their society. But the seed of empathy had been planted in the minds of many Northerners, and it began to grow. While the North and South were growing further apart, there was also a smaller but very real group of people who simply wanted to find a middle ground. They weren't abolitionists, but they weren't fire eaters either. They were moderate politicians and ordinary citizens who simply wanted the Union to stay together and believed that compromise could still save the day. They held out hope that the nation could somehow navigate this crisis without violence. But as the decade of the 1850s wore on, the moderates began to lose their voice. The political discourse became more extreme, and the chasm between the two sides grew too wide for anyone to bridge. A powerful historical fact to consider is that by 1860, the economic value of enslaved people in the South was greater than the value of all the nation's manufacturing, railroads, and productive farmland combined. This shows just how deeply intertwined the institution of slavery was with the Southern economy, and how catastrophic the prospect of its end was perceived to be. The stage was set. Decades of simmering tensions, political failures, and moral clashes had created an environment where a spark could set the whole thing alight. The economic systems, the cultural values, the very ideas of what America was supposed to be were on a collision course. And as the sound of distant drums began to echo across the land, it became clear that this was no ordinary disagreement. This was a battle for the soul of a nation. The long, slow march toward a truly terrible civil war had begun, and the peaceful compromises of the past were now just faded memories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1844 was supposed to be another clever compromise, a legislative marvel that would solve the slavery question once and for all in the Western territories. Instead, it lit a fuse that would detonate into a decade of violence and political upheaval. The act essentially repealed the old Missouri Compromise line, the one that had held the fragile peace for over 30 years. It introduced a new concept, popular sovereignty, which meant that the settlers of a territory themselves would get to decide whether to allow slavery. On the surface, this sounded like a democratic solution, a way to let the people choose their own destiny. In reality, it was an invitation to war. The moment the ink was dry, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers began to flood into the Kansas territory. They weren't just farmers looking for a new life. They were armed activists, each side determined to sway the vote. Pro-slavery forces, often called border ruffians from the neighboring slave state of Missouri, crossed the border to vote illegally and intimidate opponents. In response, anti-slavery settlers, many funded by Northern abolitionist societies, arrived with their own weapons, ready to fight for a free Kansas. The result was a chaotic and brutal series of clashes that earned the territory the grim nickname Bleeding Kansas. The violence was personal and vicious. In May of 1856, a pro-slavery mob sacked the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, destroying printing presses and burning buildings. In retaliation, a fervent abolitionist named John Brown, whom we'll hear more about later, led a small group on a raid of a pro-slavery settlement near Pottawatomie Creek, murdering 5 men with broadswords. This was not a battle between armies. It was a series of guerrilla raids and retaliatory murders that turned neighbor against neighbor. The entire episode was a microcosm of the larger national conflict, a dress rehearsal for the war to come. It proved that the issue of slavery had moved beyond the halls of Congress and into the streets, a problem that could no longer be solved with legislation alone. While Kansas was bleeding, another controversial law was stoking the fires of Northern outrage, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. As mentioned before, this act was part of the larger Compromise of 1850, and it was a masterpiece of Southern political pressure. The law empowered federal commissioners to arrest and return anyone suspected of being a runaway enslaved person without a jury trial. It also mandated that ordinary citizens, even those in free states, had to assist in the capture of these individuals if called upon. Anyone who helped a freedom seeker could be fined or imprisoned. This law was a direct assault on the moral sensibilities of many Northerners, turning them from passive observers into reluctant participants in the system of slavery. The act led to dramatic, emotional scenes in northern cities. In Boston, a city with a deep abolitionist history, federal marshals were met with angry mobs trying to free captured individuals. The case of Anthony Burns in 1854, an enslaved man who had escaped to Boston, became a flashpoint. After he was arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act, abolitionists rallied, but despite their protests and an attempt to free him, he was marched through the streets under heavy guard to a ship that would return him to the South. The sight of federal troops enforcing a law that many considered immoral left an indelible mark on the public consciousness. Historians still debate whether the Fugitive Slave Act was a tactical blunder for the South. While it gave them a legal tool to recover their property, it also galvanized the abolitionist movement in the North like nothing before. By forcing the issue into northern communities, the law stripped away the illusion that slavery was a distant problem. It made the conflict personal, a matter of conscience for every citizen. The sight of a man, woman, or child being dragged back into bondage was a far more powerful argument against slavery than any political speech could ever be. Adding to the tension was the rise of new political parties. The Whig Party, unable to unify on the issue of slavery, collapsed. In its place, the Republican Party emerged in the mid-1850s, a purely northern political force committed to preventing the expansion of slavery into the new territories. Their platform was not about abolishing slavery where it already existed, but rather about containing it. This was a direct threat to the South, which saw expansion as essential to its economic and political survival. The rise of a sectional party that held no appeal in the South was a clear sign that the two halves of the country were no longer able to share a political home. A bit of light sarcasm here. It's almost as if the plan to make everyone feel better about a terrible situation by making it a local choice backfired completely. Who would have guessed? The events in Kansas and the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act showed the country that a peaceful resolution was becoming less and less likely. The old political guard, those who had always found a way to compromise, were losing their influence. The new generation of politicians and activists were more radical, more ideological, and far less willing to back down. The country was in a state of continuous low-grade warfare, a slow-motion unraveling of the social fabric. The next acts would only accelerate this process. The stage was set for a new kind of drama, one that would no longer be confined to legislative chambers or dusty frontier towns, but would soon encompass the entire nation. If bleeding Kansas was the long fuse, then the Dred Scott decision and John Brown's raid were two massive explosions that rocked the nation. Each event, in its own way, seemed to extinguish any lingering hope for a peaceful resolution. The first was a legal thunderclap, a ruling from the highest court in the land that sought to settle the slavery question with a gavel, but instead only made things worse. The case involved Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had traveled with his owner, a U.S. Army surgeon, into free territories and states. After his owner died, Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that his residence in free lands had made him a free man. The case worked its way through the courts for a decade, finally reaching the Supreme Court in 1856. The nation held its breath, hoping for a definitive answer. What they got was a judicial declaration of war on the concept of human freedom. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, a pro-slavery Southerner, wrote the majority opinion. His ruling was a staggering blow to the abolitionist cause. First, Taney declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. This was a chilling pronouncement that effectively denied black people any legal standing. Second, he ruled that the Missouri Compromise, the very law that had tried to keep the peace for so long, was unconstitutional. Taney argued that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. He stated that enslaved people were property, and the government could not deprive a citizen of his property without due process of law. This decision was a monumental victory for the South, confirming their view that the federal government could not interfere with slavery. To the North, it was a complete and total disaster. It meant that slavery could theoretically expand anywhere, even into the free states, and that black people had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. The ruling was so sweeping that it essentially invalidated decades of political compromise. It hardened the resolve of abolitionists and convinced many Northerners that the Southern slave power had seized control of the judiciary. The Dred Scott decision was an intellectual and moral catastrophe. It turned the legal system into a tool for oppression and made it clear to many that the only way to stop the expansion of slavery was through political, not legal, means. It energized the newly formed Republican Party, whose core platform was the prohibition of slavery in the territories. The ruling was, in a way, the best thing that could have happened to the Republicans, as it gave them a powerful and clear moral outrage to rally around. 2 years later, in October of 1859, the nation was shaken by a very different kind of event, one not based on legal precedent, but on righteous violence. John Brown, the same fiery abolitionist from Bleeding, Kansas, reemerged with a new, much more audacious plan. He believed that the only way to end slavery was through armed insurrection. With a small group of followers, he launched a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, modern-day West Virginia. Brown's plan was to seize the weapons, distribute them to enslaved people in the area, and spark a massive slave revolt that would sweep through the South. It was a bold, desperate, and utterly flawed idea. His raid was a dismal failure. Local militia and then U.S. Marines, led by none other than Colonel Robert E. Lee, quickly surrounded the armory. After a brief siege, Brown and his men were captured or killed. Brown was put on trial for treason against the state of Virginia, as well as murder and inciting a slave insurrection. The trial was a media spectacle. Brown, injured but defiant, became a martyr for the abolitionist cause. While he was reviled as a madman in the South, many Northerners saw him as a hero, a man willing to die for his principles. Ralph Waldo Emerson called him a new saint who would make the gallows as glorious as the cross. The execution of John Brown in December 1859 was a deeply symbolic moment. To the South, it confirmed their worst fears, that the North was filled with dangerous, fanatical abolitionists who would stop at nothing, not even violence, to destroy their way of life. The fact that many Northerners mourned Brown's death was seen as an unforgivable act of betrayal. To the North, Brown's death was a solemn reminder of the moral rot at the heart of the nation. It was a sign that the time for talking was over. Historians still argue whether John Brown was a prophetic martyr or a deranged terrorist. There's no easy answer. His actions were undeniably violent, but his cause was just. His raid, though a military failure, was a psychological masterstroke. It eliminated the middle ground. It made it impossible to be a moderate on the issue of slavery. You were either with the system or against it, and both sides now saw violence as a legitimate path to their goals. The events of Bleeding, Kansas had shown the will to fight, but the Dred Scott decision and John Brown's raid showed that the fight was now about something much larger than a single territory. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews. The year 1860 arrived with a sense of dread hanging over the American political landscape. The events of the previous decade, Bleeding, Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid, had shattered the old political order and brought the nation to the brink. The upcoming presidential election was no ordinary contest. It was a referendum on the very future of the Union. The political parties, unable to contain the widening chasm, began to splinter along sectional lines. The Democratic Party, once the nation's dominant political force, fractured into a northern and a southern wing. The Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas, the architect of popular sovereignty, who was seen as too soft on slavery by the South. The Southern Democrats, meanwhile, chose John C. Breckinridge, a strong proponent of the expansion of slavery. This split guaranteed a Republican victory, as the anti-slavery vote would be consolidated while the pro-slavery vote was divided. The newly formed Republican Party committed to preventing the expansion of slavery, nominated Abraham Lincoln. He was a relatively unknown one-term congressman and a lawyer from Illinois, but his debates with Stephen Douglas had brought him national attention. Lincoln was not an abolitionist in the radical sense. He did not advocate for the immediate end of slavery where it already existed. His position was one of containment, arguing that while the government could not interfere with slavery in the states where it was already established, it must prevent its spread into new territories. This moderate stance, combined with the fractured opposition, made him the perfect candidate for the moment. A fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell, a last-ditch effort by moderates to hold the country together, but they had little chance of success. The election of 1860 was a four-way race, but it was really two separate elections happening at the same time. In the North, it was Lincoln versus Douglas. In the South, it was Breckinridge versus Bell. Lincoln did not even appear on the ballot in 10 Southern states, yet he won the presidency with a clear majority of the electoral votes, sweeping every Northern state. His victory was a profound shock to the South. Even though he had promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed, Southern leaders viewed his election as an existential threat. They believed that a Republican president, armed with the power of the federal government, would eventually find a way to dismantle their entire social and economic system. For months, Southern politicians had been warning that a Lincoln victory would be grounds for secession. The moment the election results were confirmed, the process began. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. Its leaders had long been the most vocal proponents of states' rights and had been preparing for this moment for years. The city of Charleston erupted in celebration, with bells ringing and citizens parading through the streets. To them, this was a second Declaration of Independence, a brave act of defiance against a tyrannical federal government. Over the next 6 weeks, 6 other states from the Deep South followed suit: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They moved quickly, holding secession conventions and voting to dissolve their ties with the United States. These states were home to the largest enslaved populations and had the most to lose from the anti-slavery movement. In February 1861, representatives from these 7 states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. They drafted a constitution that was very similar to the U.S. Constitution, but with a few key differences. It explicitly protected the institution of slavery and affirmed the sovereignty of individual states. They elected Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator from Mississippi and a military veteran, as their president. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan, a lame duck who was both indecisive and sympathetic to the Southern cause, did little to stop the secession movement. He believed that secession was illegal, but also that the federal government had no power to stop it. It was a classic case of political paralysis. Lincoln, who would not be inaugurated until March, watched from Illinois, powerless to act. He believed that the Union was perpetual and that no state had the right to leave. He knew he had to find a way to hold the remaining states together and to somehow resolve the crisis without violence, if possible. An interesting historical fact is that many people in both the North and the South did not believe a full-scale war was likely. Southerners thought the North would simply let them go, unwilling to fight a bloody conflict to hold the Union together. Many Northerners believed that the Southern fire eaters were bluffing and that the Union would hold. They were all about to be proven terribly wrong. The secession crisis was a period of immense tension and uncertainty. The nation was in a state of limbo. The Confederacy was a nation in all but name, raising armies and appointing ambassadors, while the United States still considered them part of the Union. The two sides were like two boxers in a ring, circling each other, waiting for the first punch. That first punch would come in the form of a small fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, a place that would soon become a household name and the stage for the opening act of the bloodiest war in American history. The quiet, uneasy peace was about to shatter, and the reality of a nation divided would finally be made manifest. In the early dawn hours of April 12th, 1861, a strange and unsettling quiet hung over the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The city was still and dark, but out in the bay, a small federal garrison was holding out on a small man-made island fort called Fort Sumter. For months, the fort had been a source of immense tension. It was one of the last remaining federal strongholds in the seceded South, and to the newly formed Confederate government, it was an intolerable symbol of U.S. authority. President Jefferson Davis, facing pressure to assert Confederate sovereignty, made a fateful decision. The fort must be taken. He sent a message to the Union commander, Major Robert Anderson, demanding his surrender. Anderson, a man who had been a professor at West Point to some of the very men now pointing cannons at his fort, politely refused. The Confederate commander in charge of the forces surrounding the fort was General P.G.T. Beauregard, a man who had been one of Anderson's star students at West Point. The teacher-student dynamic in this standoff adds a peculiar, almost tragic layer to the story. Beauregard, with a heavy heart, gave the order. At 4:30 a.m., a single mortar round burst over the fort. It was the signal. Confederate batteries, positioned all around the harbor, opened fire. The bombardment of Fort Sumter had begun. For 34 hours, shells rained down on the small garrison. The Union soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, returned fire, but their efforts were largely futile. Their supplies were low, and they were cut off from any hope of reinforcement. The small garrison held on, but eventually, with the fort engulfed in flames and with his men out of ammunition, Major Anderson was forced to surrender. There were no battle deaths in the bombardment itself, though a Union soldier was killed when a cannon misfired during the surrender ceremony. The Union forces marched out with their flag and were allowed to return to the North. The entire affair was less a battle than a symbolic act, but its impact was anything but symbolic. When news of the attack on Fort Sumter reached the North, the reaction was swift and furious. The attack was seen not as a local skirmish, but as a direct assault on the United States itself. The national flag, the one with the stars and stripes, had been fired upon. The long simmering divisions in the North evaporated overnight. The call to preserve the Union became a rallying cry that united abolitionists and moderates alike. President Abraham Lincoln, who had been inaugurated just a month earlier and had been trying to navigate a path to peace, now had a clear mandate for war. On April 15th, 1861, President Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months to suppress the rebellion. This was not a call for a long, bloody war, but for a short, decisive action to put down what he saw as an illegal insurrection. The response was overwhelming. Men flocked to recruiting stations across the North. They believed the war would be short, maybe a single battle, and that they'd be home by Christmas. This enthusiasm, while inspiring, was also a testament to their naivete about the scale of the conflict that was to come. Lincoln's call for volunteers, however, had the opposite effect in the Upper South. 4 states that had been wavering, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, now faced a difficult choice. They had not been in favor of secession initially, but they were also unwilling to send troops to fight against their fellow Southerners. When faced with Lincoln's demand, they chose to join the Confederacy. The secession of Virginia was particularly significant, as it was the most populous and industrialized Southern state and was home to a great military tradition. The Confederate capital was soon moved from Montgomery to Richmond, Virginia, just 100 miles from Washington, D.C. The line was now clearly drawn. The 2 sides of the conflict were officially locked in a struggle that could only be settled by force of arms. A mainstream historical fact. The secession of Virginia brought with it the Confederacy's greatest military asset, Robert E. Lee. He was offered command of the Union Army by President Lincoln, but famously declined, citing his loyalty to his home state of Virginia, even though he personally opposed secession. This decision was a microcosm of the agonizing choices many families faced, torn between loyalty to the Union and loyalty to their home states. The attack on Fort Sumter and the subsequent call to arms transformed the political crisis into a full-blown military conflict. The days of compromise and political maneuvering were over. The question of whether the United States would remain a single nation was now in the hands of soldiers. The peaceful, diplomatic world of the 1852s was a distant memory. The quiet of that early morning in Charleston had been broken by the roar of cannons, and the echo would reverberate across the continent for the next 4 long years. With the lines drawn and the armies gathering, the first major battle was inevitable. Both sides, filled with a misplaced confidence, were eager for a fight. Northern newspapers clamored for a swift march on Richmond, the new Confederate capital, promising a quick end to the rebellion. The general public, North and South, had a romantic, almost naive idea of what war would be like. They imagined glorious charges, clean uniforms, and a gentlemanly contest. This idyllic vision was about to be shattered at a small, meandering stream in Virginia. In July of 1861, the Union Army, under the command of General Irvin McDowell, a man who had studied the art of war but had never commanded an army in battle, began its slow march toward Richmond. Their objective was to strike a decisive blow and end the war before it had truly begun. Their plan was to attack a Confederate force gathered near Manassas Junction, a key railway hub not far from a small stream called Bull Run. The journey itself was something of a spectacle. Civilians, including congressmen and society ladies, packed picnics and followed the troops, expecting to watch the battle as if it were a spectator sport. They had no idea what they were about to witness. On July 21st, the Union forces launched their attack. The initial stages of the battle went well for the Union, pushing the Confederates back. But the Confederate forces, led by Generals Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard, were not as disorganized as the Union generals had assumed. As the battle raged, fresh Confederate reinforcements arrived by rail, a new and devastating wrinkle in warfare that the Union had not anticipated. A Confederate general, Barnard B., trying to rally his troops, pointed to a fellow general holding his line with unyielding resolve and shouted, "Look, there is Jackson standing like a stone wall." The general was Thomas J. Jackson, and from that moment on, he would forever be known as Stonewall Jackson. This battlefield nickname has become a legendary part of American history, and it perfectly captures the determined spirit of the Confederate defense that day. The tide of the battle began to turn. The Union attack stalled, and the Confederate line held firm. Then, a ferocious counterattack from the Confederates sent the inexperienced Union troops into a panicked retreat. The retreat turned into a full-blown rout. The Union soldiers, exhausted and terrified, dropped their weapons and fled in chaos back toward Washington. The sight of panicked soldiers and terrified civilians scrambling to escape the battlefield was a sobering moment. The picnic baskets and the elegant dresses were forgotten in the mad dash to safety. The road back to Washington was a scene of utter confusion and humiliation. The first battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, as the Confederates called it, was a stunning Confederate victory and a shocking Union defeat. The victory was a great morale booster for the South, cementing their belief that their cause was just and their fighting men were superior. It also created a sense of overconfidence, leading some to believe that the war would indeed be short and that independence was already within their grasp. For the North, the defeat was a much-needed splash of cold water. The romantic notions of a swift and glorious war vanished. It became brutally clear that this would be a long, bloody, and difficult conflict. The result of the battle had a profound effect on Northern policy. President Lincoln realized that he needed a far more organized and professional army. He replaced General McDowell with a new commander, General George B. McClellan. McClellan was a brilliant organizer and trainer, and he immediately set about transforming the demoralized rabble into the formidable fighting force that would become the Army of the Potomac. A light joke to remember the moment. The spectators who came to watch a glorious war movie got to experience a very messy, very real horror film instead. Whoops. The battle also marked a significant strategic error for the Confederacy. They won the battle, but did not pursue the retreating Union army. Many historians argue whether a more aggressive pursuit could have led to the capture of Washington, D.C., and potentially a much earlier end to the war. The fact is, the Confederate Army was as disorganized in its victory as the Union Army was in its defeat. Both sides were still learning the hard lessons of modern warfare. The first major battle of the war showed that the American Civil War would be a conflict on an entirely different scale than anyone had imagined. It was a wake-up call for both sides, a brutal end to innocence, and a clear signal that the path ahead was filled with immense hardships and tragedy. The gentle, almost sleepy air of the pre-war years had been replaced with the unmistakable smell of gunpowder and the bitter taste of defeat. After the humbling defeat at First Bull Run, the Union turned to General George B. McClellan, a man they hoped would be their savior. McClellan was an expert engineer and a meticulous organizer. He was brilliant at training and equipping the new Union Army, transforming them from a chaotic mob into a well-disciplined fighting machine, the Army of the Potomac. But he had a flaw. He was agonizingly slow and overcautious. He always believed the enemy outnumbered him, no matter what his spies said. He was, in a word, a perfectionist, and his perfectionism was a form of paralysis. For months, while the North clamored for action, McClellan trained his men, building fortifications and preparing for an advance that never seemed to come. President Lincoln famously grew frustrated, once quipping that he would like to borrow the army from McClellan if the general wasn't going to use it. Finally, in the spring of 1862, McClellan unveiled his grand plan, the Peninsula Campaign. Instead of a direct overland march on Richmond, he decided to transport his massive army by sea and land them on the peninsula between the York and James Rivers, just east of the Confederate capital. It was a clever flanking maneuver that would bypass the main Confederate defenses. The plan was sound, at least on paper. The campaign began in March, and the Union Army, a vast force of over 100,000 men, began its slow, deliberate march up the peninsula. They moved with the speed of a glacier, even laying siege to a small fort for a month because McClellan was convinced it was heavily defended, only to find the Confederates had already abandoned it. As McClellan's forces crept closer to Richmond, the Confederate command was in a state of flux. Their initial commander, Joseph E. Johnston, was wounded in a battle near the capital. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, made a bold choice and put his chief military advisor in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. This was a man we've met before, the same one who captured John Brown and famously turned down command of the Union Army, General Robert E. Lee. Lee was a different kind of general than McClellan. He was aggressive, audacious, and a master of battlefield improvisation. He had an instinct for the unexpected and a willingness to take risks. As McClellan's army sat just a few miles from Richmond, Lee launched a series of surprise attacks that became known as the 7 Days Battles, fought from June 25th to July 1st, 1862. Lee's plan was not to defeat McClellan's massive army outright, but to unnerve him, to make him believe that the Confederate forces were larger and more formidable than they actually were. Lee was brilliant at using feints and quick strikes to keep the Union Army off balance. The 7 days were a series of bloody, confused, and often brutal battles. In places like Gaines's Mill and Malvern Hill, the fighting was savage. While the Confederates technically suffered more casualties, their attacks had a psychological effect on McClellan. He was convinced that he was facing a much larger force, and instead of pushing forward to take the undefended capital, he began to retreat. He fell back from the gates of Richmond, effectively ending the Peninsula Campaign in a strategic Union defeat. A historian might call this a classic example of a failure of nerve, an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether McClellan could have taken Richmond during the Peninsula Campaign. Was his caution justified given the risks, or did his timidity cost the Union a chance for a much earlier end to the war? There's no consensus, but most would agree that his personality was a poor match for the aggressive style of Robert E. Lee. The Peninsula Campaign was a major blow to Northern morale. The public had been told that a decisive victory was just around the corner, only to see their army retreat from the very doorstep of the enemy capital. It was a humiliating setback that made the war seem far more difficult than anyone had imagined. It also showed the North that in Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy had a general of extraordinary skill, a man who could turn an impossible situation into a major victory. The Union would have to find a new commander and a new strategy to counter this formidable new foe. The war in the East had become a stalemate, a frustrating back and forth between two powerful armies. But as we'll see, the story of the war was not just being written in Virginia. While the armies in the East were locked in a frustrating stalemate, a very different kind of war was unfolding far to the west. In what became known as the Western Theater, the Union had a clear objective and a general who was not afraid to take risks, Ulysses S. Grant. The goal here was not just to capture the enemy capital, but to control the vast network of rivers that served as the Confederacy's economic and military highways, specifically the Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers. Grant's first major success came early in 1862. He captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, two key Confederate forts on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. When the Confederate commander at Fort Donelson asked for terms of surrender, Grant famously replied, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." This response earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant and made him a hero in the North. His victories cracked the Confederate defenses in the West, forcing them to pull back and opening the way for a Union advance deep into Confederate territory. But the war in the West was just as brutal as in the East. In April 1862, Grant's forces, pushing south along the Tennessee River, camped near a small church named Shiloh. They were caught completely by surprise by a massive Confederate attack led by General Albert Sidney Johnston. The Battle of Shiloh was a 2-day bloodbath, the largest and most deadly battle fought in the war up to that point. The fighting was incredibly chaotic and vicious, with both sides suffering horrific casualties. Johnston himself was mortally wounded on the first day, a major blow to the Confederate command. The Union forces, though initially pushed back and facing utter defeat, managed to hold their ground and were reinforced overnight. On the second day, Grant launched a powerful counterattack that pushed the Confederates back. Shiloh was a wake-up call for both sides in the West. It showed that the Confederates would fight with fierce determination and that the battles would be incredibly costly. The sheer scale of the casualties, over 23,000 dead, wounded, or missing, was a staggering number that horrified a nation still not accustomed to such carnage. After the battle, Grant was criticized for being caught unprepared and for the high number of casualties, but Lincoln defended him, saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Following Shiloh, the focus shifted to the Mississippi River. The Union's strategic goal was to take control of the entire river, thereby splitting the Confederacy in two and cutting off its western states from the rest of the country. A key part of this strategy was the capture of Vicksburg, Mississippi, a fortress city perched high on a bluff overlooking a bend in the river. It was a seemingly impregnable stronghold known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. The campaign for Vicksburg was a long and difficult one. Grant tried a variety of plans, from digging canals to marching his army through swamps, but nothing worked. Finally, in the spring of 1863, he embarked on a bold and highly risky maneuver. He moved his army down the west side of the Mississippi, while Union gunboats, under the cover of darkness and Confederate cannon fire, ran past the Vicksburg batteries. Grant then ferried his army across the river south of the city, cutting off his own supply lines and plunging into enemy territory. It was a daring move that went against all conventional military wisdom. For 3 weeks, Grant's army marched inland, living off the land and fighting 5 different battles, all of which were Union victories. This was a classic example of a blitzkrieg, a fast, mobile campaign that completely disoriented the enemy. He then marched his forces back toward Vicksburg and began a siege that would last for 47 days. Historians still argue whether this was Grant's greatest campaign. His decision to cut off his own supply line was either a stroke of genius or a reckless gamble that paid off. Regardless, it showed his aggressive and unconventional military mind, a sharp contrast to McClellan's extreme caution in the East. The fighting in the Western Theater, culminating in the siege of Vicksburg, was decisive. The Union was successfully implementing a strategy of controlling the rivers, a strategy that would eventually prove to be the key to victory. While the East grabbed the headlines with its epic and bloody battles, it was the slow, steady progress in the West that was systematically strangling the Confederacy. The story of the war was being written in 2 very different places by 2 very different kinds of generals, each with a crucial role to play in the outcome. The summer of 1862 was a time of immense frustration for the Union. In the East, the Peninsula Campaign had ended in a frustrating retreat. The public and President Lincoln himself were growing weary of General McClellan's extreme caution. In September, the Confederates, under the command of Robert E. Lee, decided to take a huge gamble. Lee believed a victory on Union soil might convince European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, to recognize the Confederacy and provide them with much-needed support. He also hoped that an invasion would draw the Army of the Potomac away from Virginia and relieve pressure on Richmond. With this audacious plan, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia began its march north into Maryland, a border state that still had strong Southern sympathies. Lee's plan was a complicated one, involving dividing his forces to capture a Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, while the main army continued north. As is often the case in war, a small piece of bad luck changed everything. A copy of Lee's battle plan, wrapped around 3 cigars, was found by 2 Union soldiers in a field. This document, later called the Lost Order, was immediately taken to General McClellan. For the first time, McClellan had a clear picture of the Confederate Army's movements and intentions. The gods of war had given him a golden opportunity to destroy Lee's divided army. But McClellan, being McClellan, moved slowly. He waited over 18 hours to act on the intelligence, giving Lee just enough time to realize his plans were compromised and to concentrate his forces near the small Maryland town of Sharpsburg along a creek called Antietam. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of the war. On September 17th, 1862, the two armies clashed in what would become the bloodiest single day in American history. The Battle of Antietam, known as the Battle of Sharpsburg in the South, was a day of unimaginable carnage. The fighting began at dawn in a cornfield where waves of Union and Confederate soldiers charged and countercharged through the stalks. The fighting was so fierce that the cornfield was literally mowed down by gunfire. Later, the battle moved to a sunken road that became known as Bloody Lane. Here, thousands of men fought at close quarters, and the trench-like road became filled with the dead and wounded. The final phase of the battle took place at a stone bridge, which Union forces repeatedly charged, suffering heavy losses before finally capturing it. By the end of the day, the battle was a tactical draw, but a strategic Union victory. Lee's invasion of the North had been stopped. The numbers were staggering, over 23,000 casualties in just 12 hours. The casualties at Antietam were 4 times the number of Americans killed at the D-Day invasion in World War II. The sheer scale of the death and suffering was a chilling reminder of the brutal reality of the conflict. The battle had 2 profound and lasting consequences. First, it foiled Lee's invasion and his attempt to win foreign recognition. European powers, who were closely watching the conflict, were not going to recognize a nation that couldn't even win a victory on enemy soil. The Confederate hope for foreign aid largely evaporated after Antietam. Second, the victory, however modest, gave President Lincoln the moral and political cover he needed to issue a crucial proclamation. Lincoln had been waiting for a Union victory to issue a document that would change the nature of the war from one of preserving the Union to one of liberation. He believed that if he issued it after a Union defeat, it would look like an act of desperation. Antietam was that victory. Historians still debate whether Antietam was a missed opportunity for McClellan. He had superior numbers and a copy of the enemy's plan, but he failed to use his reserves to deliver a knockout blow. His refusal to aggressively pursue the retreating Confederate army after the battle was the final straw for Lincoln, who would eventually relieve him of command. But for all its tactical shortcomings, Antietam was a turning point. It had saved the Union from a serious political and diplomatic setback. It had also set the stage for one of the most important and transformative acts in American history, an act that would fundamentally redefine the conflict and change the very meaning of American freedom. The stage was now set for the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union victory at Antietam, however bloody and incomplete, provided President Abraham Lincoln with the opportunity he had been waiting for. For a long time, Lincoln's primary goal had been to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. He had been a consistent, if cautious, opponent of slavery, but he understood that a radical move to end it could alienate the border states that remained in the Union, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and might even turn public opinion against the war. But as the war dragged on, Lincoln's thinking evolved. He realized that slavery was not just the moral cause of the war, but it was also a strategic advantage for the Confederacy. The enslaved population provided the labor force that allowed white Southern men to leave the farms and fight on the battlefield. By striking at slavery, Lincoln could simultaneously hit the Confederacy where it was most vulnerable and give the war a higher moral purpose. On September 22nd, 1862, just 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued a preliminary proclamation. He declared that on January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in states or parts of states still in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward, and forever free. This was a warning shot, a chance for the Confederate states to return to the Union and keep their slaves. Predictably, the Confederacy scoffed at the offer, a move that gave Lincoln the justification he needed to make the proclamation a reality. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. The document was a masterwork of political and military strategy. It did not free all enslaved people. It specifically applied only to those in states that were in rebellion against the Union. It did not affect slavery in the border states that had remained loyal. This was a critical distinction, as it allowed Lincoln to avoid angering the border states while still striking a powerful blow against the Confederacy. It was, in essence, a war measure, an act designed to weaken the enemy. The impact of the Emancipation Proclamation was immense, though it was not a magical stroke that instantly freed 4 million people. It took the might of the Union Army to enforce the promise of freedom. As Union forces advanced through the South, they became armies of liberation, and formerly enslaved people flocked to their lines, seeking sanctuary. The proclamation also authorized the enlistment of African American men into the Union Army. This was a revolutionary step that we will talk about in more detail later. This decision not only added much-needed manpower to the Union cause, but also gave black men a chance to fight for their own freedom and for the future of their people. The Emancipation Proclamation fundamentally changed the nature of the war. Before, it was a war to preserve the Union. Now, it was also a war to end slavery. This gave the Union cause a moral clarity that it had previously lacked and made it more difficult for European powers to support the Confederacy. Great Britain and France, whose own populations were largely anti-slavery, could not, in good conscience, support a nation whose very foundation was based on the enslavement of human beings. The proclamation was a brilliant diplomatic maneuver that helped ensure the Confederacy would remain isolated on the world stage. A light joke for you: the Confederacy's plan to get European help was a bit like trying to get a loan from your parents after you've announced you're moving out and never speaking to them again. It wasn't a great sales pitch. Historians still argue whether the Emancipation Proclamation was a bold moral act or a cynical political one. In truth, it was a complex blend of both. Lincoln was a pragmatic politician who understood that the survival of the Union required him to use every tool at his disposal, and if that meant taking a moral stand against slavery, then he was willing to do it. The proclamation's genius lay in its ability to serve both a practical military purpose and a higher moral one. It gave the war a new purpose and set the nation on a long, difficult path toward fulfilling its promise of liberty and justice for all. It was a turning point not just in the war, but in the entire arc of American history. With the Emancipation Proclamation issued, the war took on a new, more profound purpose. But on the ground, the military stalemate in the East persisted. After the Battle of Antietam, President Lincoln, tired of McClellan's inaction, replaced him with General Ambrose Burnside. Burnside was known for his impressive facial hair, the origin of the term sideburns, but he was not a gifted commander. His inexperience would lead to one of the most lopsided and disastrous Union defeats of the war at the Battle of Fredericksburg. In December 1862, Burnside's plan was simple: march his army across the Rappahannock River and attack the Confederate army, which was dug in on the heights above the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. The plan went wrong from the start. The pontoon bridges needed to cross the river were delayed, giving Robert E. Lee and his men ample time to fortify their positions on the high ground, particularly on a hill called Mary's Heights. The Confederates were so well entrenched that it was said a chicken could not cross the field without being shot. When the Union Army finally crossed, they were faced with a nearly impossible task. For an entire day, Union soldiers launched repeated frontal assaults against the Confederate lines, a series of brave but futile charges up a sloped, open field. Wave after wave of Union soldiers marched into a storm of lead, cut down by Confederate troops firing from behind a stone wall. The carnage was horrific. It was a perfect, terrible example of the futility of frontal assaults against entrenched positions. General Lee, watching from his command post, was said to have remarked, "It is well that war is so terrible, or we would grow too fond of it." The Union suffered more than 12,000 casualties, while the Confederates suffered fewer than 5,000. It was a stunning, one-sided defeat. The Union Army retreated, demoralized, and broken. The defeat at Fredericksburg led to another change in command. Lincoln, in a moment of utter despair, once again searched for a general who could win. He replaced Burnside with General Joseph Hooker, a competent and confident man who immediately set about restoring the morale of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker's nickname, Fighting Joe, reflected his aggressive spirit, and he had a well-deserved reputation for his organizational skills. In the spring of 1863, Hooker developed a brilliant plan to outflank Lee's army at Fredericksburg. Instead of a frontal assault, he would march the bulk of his forces around Lee's left and attack him from the rear. It was a cunning and promising strategy. The two armies met in May 1863 at a place known as the Wilderness, near a crossroads called Chancellorsville. The area was a dense, tangled forest of scrub oak and pine, a place where it was easy to get lost and difficult to see the enemy. As Hooker's forces moved through the thick undergrowth, Lee, with his characteristic audacity, did something no military manual would recommend. He divided his already smaller army in the face of a larger foe. He sent a force led by Stonewall Jackson on a massive 12-mile flanking march around Hooker's right. It was a risky move, but Lee trusted Jackson's skill and boldness. On the afternoon of May 2nd, Jackson's men burst out of the woods and fell upon the unsuspecting Union flank, causing a complete rout. The Union soldiers, taken by surprise, were sent reeling back in chaos. It was a masterful tactical victory for the Confederates. But the victory came at a terrible price. In the confusion of the evening, Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men. He was taken to a field hospital where his arm was amputated. He would later die from pneumonia, a loss that was an immense blow to the Confederacy. A mainstream historical fact is that Lee, upon hearing of the loss, said, "He has lost his left arm. I have lost my right." Jackson was, in every sense, Lee's most trusted and brilliant subordinate. The Battle of Chancellorsville was another spectacular Confederate victory. Lee, with a smaller army, had once again outmaneuvered and defeated a larger Union force. But the victory was a hollow one. The loss of Stonewall Jackson was an irreplaceable tragedy. It also set the stage for Lee to make his riskiest move yet, another invasion of the North, a final attempt to win the war on enemy soil. The victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville had given the Confederacy a dangerous sense of invincibility, a feeling that they could not lose. It was a feeling that was about to be put to the ultimate test. Flush with victory after Chancellorsville, and with the brilliant but costly loss of Stonewall Jackson still fresh, Robert E. Lee decided it was time to take a new, even bolder gamble. He believed that another successful invasion of the North would be a final, decisive blow. He thought a major Confederate victory on Union soil might demoralize the Northern public, convince European powers to intervene, and perhaps even force a negotiated end to the war. With the Union Army of the Potomac once again reeling, Lee began to move his army north into Pennsylvania. It was a massive undertaking, and the movement of his troops was one of the grandest military marches of the war. Meanwhile, the Union Army was in a state of chaos. After the defeat at Chancellorsville, Lincoln had replaced Fighting Joe Hooker with another new general, George G. Meade. Meade was a competent but cautious commander, and he was completely unaware of the Confederate Army's exact location. The two massive armies were like two ships in a dense fog, each trying to find the other. The collision was almost accidental. On July 1st, 1863, a Confederate brigade, looking for supplies, stumbled upon Union cavalry just outside the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. The initial skirmish quickly escalated as more and more troops from both sides rushed to the scene. The Confederates, with superior numbers early on, pushed the Union forces back through the town to a line of hills to the south. The Union soldiers, taking a defensive position, formed a long fishhook-shaped line on a series of hills and ridges, including Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Little Round Top. This line was incredibly strong, and Lee, seeing the opportunity for a decisive battle, decided to attack. The second day of the battle, July the 2nd, was a day of ferocious fighting. The Confederates launched powerful assaults on both flanks of the Union line. In the South, fierce fighting erupted in places that would become legendary. The Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and the Devil's Den. Union forces, particularly on a hill called Little Round Top, fought with incredible determination to hold their position. The 20th Maine Regiment, under the command of Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, held their ground against repeated Confederate assaults. When they were out of ammunition, Chamberlain famously ordered a bayonet charge down the hill, a desperate and brilliant move that broke the Confederate attack and saved the Union flank. The third and final day, July 3rd, was the climax of the battle. Lee, convinced that the Union center was weak after 2 days of fighting on the flanks, ordered a massive frontal assault. It was a move that went against the advice of his most trusted subordinate, General James Longstreet. The attack was named after one of its commanders, and it would forever be known as Pickett's Charge. Around 3 p.m., a force of about 12,500 Confederate soldiers marched in a line a mile wide across an open field, a distance of 3/4 of a mile. It was a magnificent and terrible sight, a throwback to the linear tactics of an earlier era. The Union artillery and musketry opened up a devastating fire, tearing huge gaps in the Confederate lines. Very few men made it to the Union defenses, and those who did were quickly overwhelmed. The charge was a complete and utter failure. Historians still argue whether Pickett's charge was a moment of insanity on Lee's part or a justifiable risk. It was an appalling disaster and the end of Lee's offensive capabilities for the rest of the war. The Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point in the Eastern Theater. The Confederates suffered a crippling defeat, losing over 28,000 men, a third of their army. Lee's army was battered and had to retreat back to Virginia. His dream of a decisive victory on Union soil was over. The battle was a strategic defeat from which the Confederacy would never fully recover. The victory, while incredibly costly for the Union, with 23,000 casualties, sent a wave of relief and renewed determination throughout the North. The war, while far from over, was now firmly on the path to a Union victory. While the Union and Confederate armies were locked in a bloody struggle at Gettysburg, 1,000 miles away, another pivotal turning point was unfolding. After the Battle of Shiloh, the Union's attention in the West had turned to the capture of Vicksburg, Mississippi, a fortress city on the bluffs of the Mississippi River. The Union's goal was to gain complete control of the river, splitting the Confederacy in two and cutting off its western states of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. This would be a major strategic blow, but Vicksburg was known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy for a reason. Its formidable defenses made a direct assault nearly impossible. After a series of failed attempts to take the city, including trying to dig canals and marching through the treacherous swamps of Louisiana, General Ulysses S. Grant decided on a radical plan. In a move that went against all conventional military wisdom, he marched his army down the west side of the Mississippi River, crossed it south of Vicksburg, and cut himself off from his own supply lines. The idea was to live off the land and surprise the Confederate forces from an unexpected direction. In a brilliant 3-week campaign in May 1863, Grant's army marched over 180 miles, won 5 battles, and finally trapped the Confederate forces in Vicksburg. With the city now surrounded, Grant began a siege that would last for 47 days. The civilians and soldiers inside Vicksburg suffered terribly. They were subjected to constant artillery bombardment and were forced to live in caves they dug into the hillsides to escape the shelling. Food and supplies dwindled to nothing, and the people of Vicksburg were reduced to eating rats, dogs, and cats to survive. The situation was desperate and grim. On July 4th, 1863, with no hope of relief and with his army and the city's population starving, the Confederate commander, General John C. Pemberton, surrendered Vicksburg to Grant. It was a humiliating and total defeat for the Confederacy. The date of the surrender, July 4th, was chosen by Pemberton in the hopes of getting more favorable terms from Grant, who he reasoned would not want to spill more blood on Independence Day. It worked to a degree. Pemberton's men were paroled, meaning they were released with the promise not to fight again. This was a common practice early in the war, though it would become less frequent later on. The fall of Vicksburg was an immense victory for the Union. It gave them full control of the Mississippi River. President Lincoln, overjoyed, famously said, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." The Confederacy was now split in two. Its western states could no longer send men, food, or supplies to the Eastern Front. It was a strategic amputation that crippled the South's ability to wage war, a mainstream historical fact. The surrender of Vicksburg on July 4th meant that the Confederacy had lost two of its most critical battles on the same day. Lee's defeat at Gettysburg was a major blow, but the fall of Vicksburg was arguably the more strategically important turning point of the war. While Gettysburg stopped the Confederate invasion of the North, Vicksburg sealed the fate of the Confederacy by dividing it and choking off its supply lines. Historians still argue whether the Eastern Theater or the Western Theater was more important. While the East had the famous generals and battles, it was the methodical, grinding campaigns in the West, led by Grant, that truly wore down the Confederacy and led to its eventual collapse. The fall of Vicksburg was the final piece of the puzzle, the culmination of a long and brilliant campaign. It cemented Grant's reputation as a general who could win, a man who, unlike his counterparts in the East, was not afraid of a long, brutal fight. The loss of Vicksburg, combined with the defeat at Gettysburg, was a devastating 1-2 punch for the Confederacy. The twin defeats marked the end of the South's high tide. From this point on, the Confederacy would be on the defensive, its armies slowly but surely being ground down by the superior manpower and resources of the North. The end of the war was still a long way off, but the strategic outcome was no longer in doubt. While the Union celebrated its twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, all was not calm on the home front. The war was taking a heavy toll, not just in casualties, but on the public's patience. The initial enthusiasm for the conflict had long faded, replaced by a growing sense of war weariness. The mounting death toll, the economic disruptions, and the realization that the war would be long and bloody began to fuel a powerful opposition movement in the North. This dissent came to a head in July of 1863, just days after the victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, with the outbreak of the New York City draft riots. The federal government, desperate for more soldiers, had passed a new law, the Enrollment Act of 1863. This was the first time in U.S. history that the government had a national conscription, a draft. The law was immediately controversial, primarily because it contained a glaring injustice. A wealthy man could pay a $300 commutation fee to avoid service, or he could hire a substitute to fight in his place. To the poor and working class, many of them recent Irish immigrants, this was seen as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. They felt that they were being asked to die for a war that was not theirs, while the wealthy could buy their way out. The simmering anger exploded on July 13th, 1863. When the names for the draft lottery were announced, a mob of working-class men, many of them Irish, erupted in violence. The riot was a chaotic and brutal affair that lasted for 4 days. The mob's fury was initially directed at draft offices and symbols of federal authority. But as the violence escalated, it took a dark and racial turn. The rioters, many of whom were competing with free African Americans for jobs, blamed the black population for the war and the draft. They saw the Emancipation Proclamation not as a document of freedom, but as a threat to their economic security. The mobs turned on the city's black population with horrifying brutality. Homes and businesses in black neighborhoods were looted and burned. The colored orphan asylum, a symbol of black progress, was set on fire. African Americans were hunted down in the streets, beaten, and lynched. The police force was quickly overwhelmed, and it took several regiments of Union troops, fresh from the battlefield at Gettysburg, to restore order. They arrived and fired into the crowds, killing hundreds. The final death toll is still debated, but it was one of the most violent episodes of civil unrest in American history, a powerful and telling historical fact. The New York City draft riots were a microcosm of the deep-seated social and racial tensions that existed in the North. The war was not universally popular, and the public's support was far from monolithic. There was a significant anti-war movement, often called the Copperheads, who believed the war was a mistake and should be ended through negotiation. These people were often aligned with the Democratic Party, and they saw Lincoln as a tyrant who was overstepping his constitutional authority. The riots showed the precarious state of Northern morale and the deep divisions that existed even within the Union. For Lincoln, it was a stark reminder that while he was fighting a war on the battlefield, he was also fighting a war of public opinion at home. The riots served as a clear signal that the government's policies, particularly the draft and emancipation, needed careful handling to maintain public support. Historians still argue whether the New York City draft riots were primarily a class-based rebellion against an unfair law or a race-based uprising fueled by racism. In truth, it was a complex mix of both, a tangled web of economic anxiety and racial prejudice. The riots were a brutal demonstration of the fact that the struggle for freedom was not just a Southern issue, it was a national one. Even in the North, the idea of a multiracial society was a concept that many people were not yet ready to accept. The memory of the riots served as a constant reminder that the journey to a more perfect union would be a long and difficult one, even after the last shot was fired. While the major battles on land raged, a silent but no less deadly war was being fought at sea. The Union's naval strategy was a crucial component of its overall plan to defeat the Confederacy. The idea, championed by General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, was to use the immense power of the Union Navy to blockade the entire southern coastline. This strategy, dubbed the Anaconda Plan by a mocking press, was meant to slowly strangle the Confederate economy by preventing it from exporting its most valuable crop, cotton, and from importing much-needed war supplies and manufactured goods. The plan was not as fast or as dramatic as a land invasion, but it was a methodical, grinding strategy that would eventually prove decisive. The Union Navy, starting with only a handful of ships, had to build a massive fleet of hundreds of vessels to patrol thousands of miles of coastline from the Chesapeake Bay all the way down to Texas. They established a tight blockade of every major Confederate port, including Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. The blockade was not a perfect sieve, of course. Daring Confederate blockade runners, often fast, low-profile ships, would try to slip through the Union patrols at night. While many were successful, thousands were captured or sunk over the course of the war. The blockade had a devastating effect on the Confederate economy. The price of imported goods, from coffee to medicine, skyrocketed, and the value of Confederate currency plummeted. The South's main source of wealth, its cotton, piled up in warehouses, unable to be sold on the international market. This economic strangulation made it nearly impossible for the Confederacy to sustain a long war. One of the most dramatic and famous naval encounters of the war occurred in March of 1862 at Hampton Roads, Virginia. The Confederacy, desperate to break the Union blockade, had taken the scuttled Union steam frigate Merrimac and covered it in iron plates, renaming it the CSS Virginia. This ironclad warship was a fearsome vessel, and in its first action, it easily sank 2 Union wooden warships, demonstrating the absolute superiority of iron over wood in naval combat. The North was terrified. They had no ship that could stop this monster. But unbeknownst to the Confederates, the Union had its own ironclad, the USS Monitor. It was an experimental vessel, a strange-looking ship with a revolving turret and a very low profile. The next day, the 2 ships met in a legendary duel. The Battle of the Ironclads was a spectacle to behold, a clash of 2 armored beasts firing at each other for hours. The cannonballs simply bounced off their iron armor. Neither ship was able to sink the other, and the battle ended in a draw. However, the fight had a crucial strategic outcome. The Monitor had stopped the Virginia from breaking the Union blockade, and the age of wooden warships was effectively over. A fun little historical fact. The USS Monitor was so low to the water that sailors said it was like a cheese box on a raft. While the ironclads were a technological marvel, the real work of the Union Navy was the monotonous, unglamorous job of blockading. The Navy also played a crucial role in supporting land campaigns, particularly in the Western Theater, where gunboats that helped Ulysses S. Grant capture forts and control the rivers. For example, the Union Navy, under Admiral David Farragut, managed to capture the vital port city of New Orleans in April of 1862. This was a major blow to the Confederacy, as New Orleans was their largest city and a key hub for commerce. The capture of New Orleans was a significant step toward gaining control of the Mississippi River. Historians still debate whether the naval blockade was the most important factor in the Union victory. While it was a slow, long-term strategy, it gradually starved the Confederacy of the resources it needed to continue the fight. The Union Navy's control of the seas and rivers was a constant, relentless pressure that the South had no way to counter. The Civil War, while often remembered for its grand land battles, was also a testament to the power of a modern navy and the effectiveness of economic warfare. The Emancipation Proclamation was a powerful document, but it was not just a piece of paper. Its promise of freedom was to be made real by the actions of men who had been denied their liberty. With the stroke of a pen, President Lincoln had authorized the enlistment of African American men into the Union Army and Navy. This was a revolutionary step, a decision that would not only provide a massive new source of manpower for the North, but would also give the war a moral dimension that it had previously lacked. The formation of the United States Colored Troops, USCT, was a moment of profound change. The recruitment process was slow at first. Many white Union soldiers and officers were skeptical, doubting that black men would make good soldiers. They held deeply ingrained prejudices and believed that African Americans were not capable of fighting with the same bravery or discipline as white men. But the black men who volunteered were motivated by something far more powerful than a paycheck. They were fighting for their freedom, the freedom of their families, and the future of their people. Frederick Douglass, a prominent abolitionist, famously argued that black men should enlist, saying, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S., and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." Over the course of the war, nearly 180,000 black men, comprising about 10% of the Union Army, served in the USCT. They were initially paid less than their white counterparts and were often commanded by white officers. They were also assigned to the most dangerous and grueling jobs, from manual labor to defending fortified positions. But they were determined to prove their worth. They fought in over 400 battles and skirmishes, and their bravery on the battlefield quickly silenced their critics. A significant moment that changed public opinion was the Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July 1863. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first all-black regiments, led a heroic but doomed assault on the Confederate-held fort. The attack was a tactical failure, with the regiment suffering heavy casualties, but their incredible bravery and discipline under fire became a symbol of black valor. The story of the 54th, immortalized in the film Glory, was told in northern newspapers, and it helped change the minds of many who had doubted the fighting ability of black soldiers. It was no longer a question of whether they would fight. It was a question of how brave they would be. The valor of the USCT had a profound effect on the war. Not only did they provide a much-needed boost in manpower for the Union, but their participation also served to legitimize the cause of emancipation in the eyes of many Northerners. They were fighting and dying for the cause, and it became increasingly difficult for anyone to argue that the war was not also about ending slavery. The Confederacy, of course, refused to recognize black soldiers as legitimate combatants. They were often executed or re-enslaved if captured, a policy that led to a breakdown in prisoner exchanges. The most infamous example of this policy was the Fort Pillow Massacre in Tennessee, where Confederate forces, under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest, massacred black soldiers who had surrendered. This event further hardened the resolve of black troops, who saw that their fight was a matter of life or death. Historians still argue whether the USCT's military contribution was as significant as their political and social one. While their numbers were smaller than white regiments, their presence on the battlefield and their willingness to die for their country fundamentally altered the course of the war and the future of the nation. Their service was a crucial step on the long road toward citizenship and civil rights. The war was no longer just a conflict between two opposing governments. It was a struggle for the very soul of the nation, and the brave men of the USCT were proving that they were worthy of a place in that new, more perfect union. With the victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the tide of the war had definitively turned, but the Confederacy was far from defeated, and its most formidable army, the Army of Northern Virginia, under Robert E. Lee, was still a powerful fighting force. President Lincoln, now with a new confidence in his military leaders, decided it was time to put a new general in command of the entire Union war effort. In March of 1864, he appointed Ulysses S. Grant as General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant, who had a reputation for dogged determination and a willingness to accept heavy casualties to achieve his goals, was the perfect man for the job. He was not a man of fancy maneuvers, but of brutal, relentless forward motion. Grant's plan was simple and direct: coordinate a simultaneous, two-pronged offensive. He would personally take command of the Army of the Potomac in the east, and he would direct another great general, William Tecumseh Sherman, to lead an advance on Atlanta in the west. The idea was to keep both of the Confederacy's main armies so busy that they could not support each other. Grant's personal objective was to destroy Lee's army, no matter the cost. His campaign, which began in May 1864, would be known as the Overland Campaign. The campaign was a continuous, 4-week series of brutal battles and relentless marching. The fighting began in the dense, tangled undergrowth of the wilderness, the same place where Lee had defeated Hooker at Chancellorsville the previous year. This time, Lee's men could not fully exploit the terrain, and the fighting was incredibly fierce and chaotic. After a bloody 2-day stalemate, previous Union generals would have retreated. But Grant famously did something different. He did not retreat. He said, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." He simply disengaged from the battlefield and moved his entire army to the left, positioning himself to continue the march south toward Richmond. It was a stunning display of will. The two armies clashed again and again at places that would become synonymous with carnage: Spotsylvania Court House and Cold Harbor. At Spotsylvania, the fighting was particularly vicious at a bend in the Confederate line known as the Bloody Angle, where the men fought for nearly 20 hours in pouring rain, often at close quarters and with bayonets. The casualties were staggering on both sides. Just a few weeks later at Cold Harbor, Grant ordered a massive frontal assault against a heavily fortified Confederate position. The attack was a complete failure, with 7,000 Union casualties in less than an hour. Grant would later say that it was the only attack he ever regretted ordering. A mainstream historical fact. The Overland Campaign was a strategic success for the Union, but a tactical bloodbath. While Grant suffered far more casualties than Lee, around 55,000 to Lee's 33,000, he was able to replace his losses, while Lee, with his much smaller army, could not. It was a war of attrition, and Grant understood that he could win a war of numbers. The campaign ended not with a final, climactic battle, but with Grant's forces outflanking Lee's and settling into a long siege outside the key railroad hub of Petersburg, Virginia. The campaign had been a relentless, grinding war of attrition that forever changed the way the public viewed the war. It was no longer a series of clean, dramatic battles, but a bloody, continuous slog. Grant's strategy, while costly, had achieved its objective. He had kept Lee's army engaged, prevented him from reinforcing other areas of the Confederacy, and pushed the war to the very doorstep of Richmond. Lee was now trapped, and the end was in sight. A light joke for you. The difference between Grant and previous Union generals was that when they met a brick wall, they turned around, but Grant just started looking for a really big sledgehammer. The Overland campaign was a testament to Grant's resolve and a chilling preview of the modern warfare that would define the 20th century. It was not pretty, and it was incredibly costly in human lives, but it was a winning strategy. Lee, for all his genius, was now facing a general who would not back down and who had the resources to win a war of attrition. The focus of the war in the East now shifted from open field battles to a long, grinding siege, a final, slow squeeze on the Confederate capital. As Ulysses S. Grant began his relentless march toward Richmond, another critical campaign was unfolding in the Western Theater. This one was led by General William Tecumseh Sherman, a man with a stern look and an even sterner resolve. His objective was a city of immense strategic importance, Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta was not just a symbol of the Confederacy's industrial capacity. It was a key railroad hub, a supply center, and a vital lifeline for the entire Southern war effort. If Atlanta fell, it would be a major blow to Confederate morale and its ability to wage war. Sherman began his campaign in May of 1864, the same month Grant started his Overland campaign. Unlike Grant, who was constantly fighting Lee's main army, Sherman faced a more mobile, defensive enemy. The Confederate forces in the area were under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston, a master of defensive warfare and a cautious strategist. Johnston's plan was not to defeat Sherman in a major battle, but to slowly retreat, using the mountainous terrain of northern Georgia to his advantage, and forcing Sherman to fight a series of costly, time-consuming battles. The campaign was a long, grinding chess match. Sherman would outflank Johnston's defensive positions, forcing him to retreat. Johnston would then establish a new defensive line, and the process would repeat itself. The two armies were never far apart, and the fighting was constant, though rarely on the scale of a Gettysburg or a Shiloh. The constant pressure was wearing on both sides, but Sherman, with his larger army and superior supplies, was a relentless opponent. The constant fighting and maneuvering took its toll. Finally, in July, with Sherman's army closing in on Atlanta, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who was a much more aggressive military thinker than Johnston, grew frustrated with Johnston's constant retreats. He made a controversial decision to replace Johnston with the more aggressive General John Bell Hood. Hood was a fighter, a man of immense personal courage, and he was determined to stop Sherman's advance. Hood immediately went on the offensive, launching a series of attacks on Sherman's army outside of Atlanta. But his attacks were poorly executed and failed to dislodge the Union forces. After these failed attempts, Sherman settled in for a siege, bombarding the city with artillery and extending his lines to cut off the railroad supply lines. For months, The two armies were locked in a stalemate, a long, brutal fight of entrenchment and raids. Then, in early September, Sherman's men finally succeeded in cutting the last railroad line into Atlanta. With his supplies cut off and his forces surrounded, General Hood was forced to abandon the city. On September 2nd, 1864, Sherman's army marched into Atlanta. It was a monumental victory for the Union, and it came at a moment when the North was deeply war-weary. The news of the city's fall was a major morale booster for the Union, a clear sign that victory was within their grasp. A mainstream historical fact. The capture of Atlanta was a crucial event that had a direct impact on the upcoming presidential election. The Northern public, tired of the long war and its mounting death toll, was beginning to turn against President Lincoln. His opponent, General George B. McClellan, was running on a platform of ending the war through negotiation. The capture of Atlanta, a major and tangible victory, gave Lincoln the political momentum he desperately needed. The victory proved that the Union could win the war, and it gave the voters a reason to stick with the man who was leading them to victory. The fall of Atlanta was not just a military triumph, it was a political one. It ensured Abraham Lincoln's re-election, which, as we'll see in the next section, was a crucial step toward the end of the war. Sherman's victory was a testament to his methodical, grinding strategy, a strategy that aimed to not just defeat the enemy's army, but to break their will to fight. With Atlanta now in Union hands, the stage was set for the next, and arguably most destructive, phase of the war. The fall of Atlanta in September 1864 was more than a military victory. It was the political turning point that secured Abraham Lincoln's re-election. For months, his presidency had seemed to be on shaky ground. The North was suffering from a profound sense of war weariness. The casualty lists were growing longer, the cost of the war was soaring, and there seemed to be no end in sight. The political opposition, a faction within the Democratic Party known as the Copperheads, was gaining momentum. They were outspoken critics of the war, advocating for an immediate end to the conflict and a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. This anti-war sentiment was widespread, particularly in the Midwest and in urban centers, and it made Lincoln's re-election seem like a long shot. The Democrats nominated George B. McClellan, the former Union general who had been fired by Lincoln, for his extreme caution and his unwillingness to fight Robert E. Lee. McClellan ran on a contradictory platform. He promised to continue the war to preserve the Union, but also to find a way to end it peacefully. He was a popular figure with the troops he had once commanded, and his candidacy represented a very real threat to Lincoln's political future. The election was, in essence, a referendum on whether the American public had the stomach to continue the war. As the summer wore on, the news was bleak. Grant's Overland campaign was a strategic success, but a tactical bloodbath, with tens of thousands of casualties. The public saw a relentless march of death, not a methodical path to victory. Lincoln himself was convinced he would lose. In a private note he wrote in August, he confided that it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. His political opponents were relentless, painting him as a tyrant who had suspended habeas corpus, an incompetent commander-in-chief, and a leader who was dragging the country into an endless, bloody conflict. Then, On September 2nd, the news of the fall of Atlanta reached the North. It was a massive psychological victory. It was a clear, undeniable sign of progress. It was something tangible that the public could point to and say, "We are winning." The news turned the political tide almost overnight. The victory revitalized the Union cause and gave the public a renewed sense of hope. The belief that the war could be won, and won soon, began to take hold. The Republican Party, which had temporarily rebranded itself as the Union Party to attract pro-war Democrats, was able to use the victory to argue that a change in leadership would be disastrous. They argued that a vote for McClellan was a vote to throw away all the sacrifices that had been made. The soldiers, many of whom were allowed to vote in the field, overwhelmingly supported Lincoln. A crucial historical fact to remember is that in the 1864 election, Lincoln's victory was a testament to the North's ability to maintain a functional democracy even in the midst of a civil war. This was something that the Confederacy, with its deeply autocratic and hierarchical structure, could not and did not do. When the votes were counted, Lincoln won a decisive victory. He won the popular vote by a significant margin and took 212 of 233 electoral votes. The re-election of Abraham Lincoln was the final nail in the coffin for any Confederate hopes of a negotiated peace. It was a clear signal that the North would not stop fighting until the war was won and the Union was restored. Historians still argue whether the war would have ended differently if McClellan had won. While McClellan himself was a Unionist, his political party was filled with people who were willing to end the war without a victory. It's safe to say that a McClellan presidency would have led to a very different end to the conflict, one that might have left slavery intact or the Union permanently fractured. The election of 1864 was a powerful affirmation of Lincoln's leadership and the Union's resolve. The country, despite its immense suffering, had made a choice to see the war through to its conclusion. The path to victory was now clear, and the full weight of the Union's superior resources could now be brought to bear on the remaining Confederate forces. After the capture of Atlanta, General William Tecumseh Sherman made a dramatic and controversial decision. Instead of chasing the Confederate Army under General Hood, he proposed a radical new strategy to his commander, Ulysses S. Grant. Sherman believed that to end the war, they had to do more than just defeat the Confederate armies. They had to break the will of the Southern people to fight. His plan was to march his army of 60,000 men from Atlanta to the sea, cutting a wide 60-mile path of destruction through the heart of Georgia. It was a strategy of total war, a term that would later be used to describe conflicts of the 20th century. Grant approved the plan, and in November of 1864, Sherman's army left Atlanta, burning the city's military and industrial buildings to the ground. They cut the telegraph lines, severing all communication with the outside world, and for the next 5 weeks, they disappeared. The North held its breath, anxiously awaiting news of his army's fate. The South, meanwhile, watched in horror as the Union Army advanced. Sherman's march to the sea was not just a military campaign, it was a psychological one. His army did not live off of supply lines. They foraged for food, taking what they needed from the local populace. His men were ordered to destroy anything of military value: railroad tracks, bridges, factories, and cotton gins. The destruction was systematic and complete. They would heat railroad ties and wrap them around trees, a grim symbol of the destruction they were leaving behind. They became known as Sherman's neckties. While there was some looting and violence against civilians, Sherman's main goal was to make the war so terrible for the Southern populace that they would demand their leaders end the conflict. The march was an incredible success. There was no army in Georgia capable of stopping Sherman. The Confederate forces under General Hood had foolishly marched north into Tennessee, hoping to draw Sherman out, only to be badly defeated. This left Georgia defenseless. As Sherman's army advanced, thousands of formerly enslaved people flocked to his army, seeking freedom and protection. The march was, for them, a march of liberation. On December 21st, 1864, Sherman's army arrived at Savannah, Georgia. The city, defended by a small force, surrendered without a fight. Sherman famously telegraphed President Lincoln, offering him the city as a Christmas gift. The capture of Savannah was a moment of immense relief and celebration in the North. It proved that Sherman's daring plan had worked, and it gave the Union a new, secure port from which to operate. A light joke for you? When Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, he probably didn't include the part about the army stealing everyone's chickens. That's a detail you save for the book. An open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Sherman's march to the sea was a justifiable military tactic. Was it a necessary and effective way to end the war more quickly, or was it a barbaric act that violated the laws of war and created lasting bitterness in the South? There is no easy answer, but it's clear that the march was incredibly effective at demoralizing the Southern population. Following the capture of Savannah, Sherman turned his army north and began a similar campaign through the Carolinas, a march that was arguably even more destructive. The Carolinas were seen as the heart of the rebellion, and Sherman's men showed less restraint. The march to the sea was a powerful demonstration of the Union's overwhelming power and a clear sign that the Confederacy's days were numbered. The war was no longer being fought just on the battlefield. It was being fought on the home front, and the South's ability to resist was crumbling under the weight of this new, terrifying strategy. As Sherman's army tore through the South, the main Confederate army in the East, under the command of Robert E. Lee, was trapped. After the brutal Overland campaign, Lee's forces had retreated to Petersburg, Virginia, a vital railroad hub just south of the Confederate capital of Richmond. Ulysses S. Grant, with his relentless pressure, quickly followed and began a long, grueling siege that would last for over 9 months. This was a new kind of warfare for the Civil War, one of trenches, fortifications, and attrition. It was a brutal preview of the trench warfare that would define World War I. The siege of Petersburg was a long, slow squeeze. The two armies faced each other in a series of elaborate trenches and earthworks that stretched for over 30 miles. The fighting was not a series of grand battles, but a constant grinding affair of skirmishes, raids, and sniper fire. Soldiers on both sides endured freezing cold, blistering heat, disease, and the constant psychological pressure of being under siege. The conditions were miserable, and morale was constantly under threat. The Confederacy with its dwindling resources, was suffering far more. Its soldiers were poorly fed, their uniforms were in tatters, and they were short on ammunition. Grant, on the other hand, had the full weight of the Union's industrial power behind him. He had a steady stream of reinforcements and supplies, and he used his superior numbers to constantly extend his lines, forcing Lee's already thin lines to stretch even further. A powerful and tragic moment during the siege was the Battle of the Crater. In July 1864, a regiment of Union coal miners, many of them from Pennsylvania, dug a long tunnel under the Confederate lines and filled it with 4 tons of gunpowder. The plan was to detonate the bomb, create a massive gap in the Confederate defenses, and then launch an assault. The explosion was a spectacular success, blowing a giant hole in the Confederate line and creating a massive crater, 170 feet long and 30 feet deep. But the Union assault that followed was a complete and utter failure. The troops, poorly led, hesitated to go around the crater and instead charged directly into it, getting bogged down and becoming easy targets for the now recovering Confederate forces. It was a tactical disaster and a humiliating defeat for the Union, a stark reminder that even with a good plan, things could still go terribly wrong. Despite the occasional setbacks, Grant's strategy was working. The constant pressure was taking its toll. The Confederacy was starving, and desertions were becoming a major problem. Lee, with his brilliant tactical mind, could only react. He could no longer take the offensive. The siege was a contest of endurance, and the Union had a seemingly endless supply of men and resources. As the siege wore on, it became clear that the fall of Petersburg would also mean the fall of Richmond. The two cities were linked, and once Petersburg's rail lines were cut, Richmond would be completely isolated. The Confederate government and its capital, the very symbols of the rebellion, were now on a clock. An open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of Grant's strategy of attrition. While it was undeniably successful, the human cost was immense. Was it a necessary evil to end the war, or could a more elegant solution have been found? The question of whether the ends justified the means is a central debate in Civil War history. In the final days of the siege, in April 1865, Grant launched a final, powerful offensive. Lee, with his starving and exhausted army, could no longer hold the line. He was forced to abandon Petersburg and Richmond. The Confederate capital was set on fire by retreating soldiers, and the citizens who were left behind had no choice but to surrender to the Union forces. The fall of Richmond was a powerful symbolic victory for the Union, a sign that the end was truly at hand. The Confederacy's grand experiment was crumbling, and its leader, Jefferson Davis, was now a man without a country, on the run. With the fall of Petersburg and Richmond, the end of the Confederacy was no longer a question of if, but when. Robert E. Lee's once mighty Army of Northern Virginia, now starving, exhausted, and a mere fraction of its former size, was on the run. Lee's hope was to link up with another Confederate army in North Carolina, a force commanded by General Joseph E. Johnston, and continue the fight. It was a desperate plan, a final long-shot gamble that relied on a swift and successful escape. The retreat from Richmond was a nightmarish ordeal. The Confederate soldiers were starving, many of them marching with no shoes on their feet, leaving bloody footprints on the ground behind them. They were constantly harassed by Union cavalry, who attacked their flanks and cut off their lines of escape. Grant, with his larger, better supplied army, was in full pursuit. The chase was relentless, a final, grueling test of endurance for both sides. The Union soldiers, knowing the end was near, were invigorated, while the Confederates were a demoralized and broken force. As Lee's army moved west, it became increasingly clear that his hopes were fading. The Union cavalry, under the brilliant command of General Philip Sheridan, was a constant menace, always one step ahead. Sheridan, a man known for his aggressive tactics and a complete lack of fear, was a perfect match for Grant's relentless strategy. His men were fast and mobile, and they were experts at harassment and destruction. They burned supply depots and bridges, destroying any chance Lee had of getting supplies or reinforcements. A powerful historical fact. The final days of the Confederacy were a series of devastating blows. Not only was Lee's army on the run, but President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet were also in flight, a final, desperate attempt to continue the government from a new location. The Confederacy, once a proud and defiant nation, was now a government without a capital and an army without a home. On April 6, 1865, the Union cavalry cut off a large portion of Lee's retreating army at a place called Sailor's Creek. The battle was a complete disaster for the Confederates. Thousands of soldiers were captured, and the Confederate line of command was shattered. Lee, watching the rout, famously remarked, "My God, has the army been dissolved?" It was a moment of profound despair, a stark realization that the end was truly at hand. The few men who remained with him were loyal but exhausted, their will to fight slowly ebbing away. Lee's final hope was to reach a rail depot where he could get food for his starving men. But Grant, with his relentless pressure, was constantly cutting off his escape routes. The two armies were a winding column of men marching toward their final confrontation. On April 9th, the Union Army surrounded Lee's remaining forces at a small village called Appomattox Court House. There was no escape. Lee's forces were outnumbered and out of options. A final, desperate attempt by some of his men to break through the Union lines failed. The commander of the Union forces in front of them sent a message to Lee, telling him that the forces in front were not just cavalry, but the entire Union infantry, under Grant's direct command. The jig was up. A light joke for you. Lee's last retreat was so desperate, his men were probably more worried about where their next meal was coming from than where the enemy was. It's hard to fight on an empty stomach. The Confederacy's final days were a testament to the brutal, grinding nature of the war. There was no single climactic battle that ended the conflict. It was a slow, methodical strangulation, a relentless push that wore the Confederacy down to nothing. The end was not a glorious finale, but a quiet, sad whimper. Lee, with his options exhausted, knew that to continue fighting would be a senseless waste of lives. He had to surrender, and the final scene of the war was about to unfold. The morning of April 9th, 1865, dawned quiet and cool over the small Virginia village of Appomattox Court House. After the relentless final chase, it was clear to everyone, from the lowliest private to the highest-ranking general, that the end had come. There was no longer any hope for escape. Robert E. Lee, with a heavy heart, sent a message to Ulysses S. Grant, requesting a meeting to discuss terms of surrender. Grant, who had been pushing his men to their limits in the pursuit, received the message with a sense of relief. The two generals, who had once served together in the Mexican-American War, were about to meet and write the final chapter of the conflict. The surrender meeting took place in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house. It's a bit of an interesting and sad bit of trivia that McLean had moved to Appomattox to escape the war, only to have the final act take place in his very living room. Grant, known for his simple, unadorned uniform, arrived first. He was caked in mud, having ridden hard to get to the meeting, and looked a bit disheveled. Lee, by contrast, was dressed in his finest uniform, a pristine gray coat with a red sash, looking every bit the proud and dignified commander of a beaten but not broken army. The contrast between the two men, one a symbol of the rugged, pragmatic Union, and the other of the refined, classical South, was striking. The meeting itself was short and surprisingly cordial. The two men reminisced about their time in the old army, a quiet moment of shared history before they got down to business. Lee asked Grant what his terms were. Grant, who had no formal instructions from President Lincoln, wrote out the terms himself on the spot with a few crucial points in mind. First, all Confederate soldiers were to lay down their arms and go home. Second, they would not be held as prisoners of war as long as they did not take up arms against the United States again. Third, and most importantly, Grant showed an immense act of generosity and grace. He allowed the Confederate soldiers to keep their horses and mules, a vital concession since many of them would need the animals for spring planting. He also ordered that 25,000 rations be distributed to the starving Confederate army. This act of compassion was a crucial moment in the surrender. It was a clear signal from Grant and from the Union that the goal was not to humiliate the South, but to reintegrate them back into the Union. It was a first step toward healing the deep wounds of the conflict. Lee, visibly moved by Grant's kindness, simply said, "This will do much toward conciliating our people." An open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the impact of Grant's terms of surrender. Were they an act of magnanimous forgiveness that helped pave the way for a more peaceful Reconstruction, or were they too lenient, failing to hold the Confederate leadership accountable for their actions and laying the groundwork for the lost cause narrative? The debate goes on, but it's clear that Grant's terms set a tone of reconciliation rather than retribution. The surrender ceremony took place a few days later. The Confederate soldiers, with a quiet dignity, stacked their rifles, furled their battle flags, and handed them over. As the Confederate soldiers marched by, the Union soldiers did not cheer or jeer. They stood silently, as a mark of respect for a defeated but brave enemy. The long, bloody saga of the American Civil War was for all intents and purposes over. The war would not officially end until a few weeks later, when other Confederate armies surrendered, but the surrender at Appomattox was the final, symbolic end. The dream of a separate nation had died, and the slow, difficult process of rebuilding a single nation could finally begin. Just 5 days after the surrender at Appomattox, the nation was thrown into a state of stunned grief. The joyous celebrations that had erupted in the North were silenced by an act of incomprehensible violence. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, were attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. It was a rare night out for the weary president, a moment of relaxation after years of immense stress. As the play progressed, a famous actor named John Wilkes Booth, a fervent Confederate sympathizer, slipped into the president's private box. Booth was a well-known stage performer and a deeply committed Confederate. He was part of a larger conspiracy to decapitate the Union government by assassinating Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. Booth was the only one to succeed. As Lincoln sat watching the play, Booth shot him in the back of the head at close range. He then leaped from the box to the stage, breaking his leg in the fall, and famously shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants." He then escaped into the night. The president was carried across the street to a boarding house, where doctors worked through the night to save him. But the wound was mortal. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. He was the first American president to be assassinated, and his death was a profound shock to a nation that had just celebrated the end of its most brutal war. The entire country, both North and South, was plunged into mourning. The manhunt for John Wilkes Booth that was one of the largest in American history. A massive reward was offered for his capture, and federal troops fanned out across the countryside. 11 days after the assassination, Booth was cornered in a tobacco barn in Virginia. When he refused to surrender, the barn was set on fire, and he was shot and killed. The other conspirators were quickly arrested, tried, and 4 of them were hanged for their role in the plot. The assassination of Lincoln was a national tragedy, but it also had a major impact on the future of the nation. Lincoln had been a proponent of a lenient and compassionate approach to Reconstruction, the process of rebuilding the country and reintegrating the southern states. He had planned to use his second term to heal the nation's wounds, with malice toward none, with charity for all. His successor, Andrew Johnson, was a Democrat from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union, but he lacked Lincoln's political skill and moral authority. A powerful historical fact is that Lincoln's assassination was a major blow to the cause of reconciliation. Many in the North, who had just been celebrating the end of the war, now saw the South as unrepentant and treacherous. The assassination fueled a desire for retribution and punishment, a desire that would heavily influence the political climate of the coming years. The assassination also created a power vacuum at the very moment when the nation needed strong, decisive leadership. The Congress, now dominated by a group of Republicans known as the Radical Republicans, had a much harsher view of Reconstruction than Lincoln had. They believed the South needed to be punished for the war, and that the rights of the newly freed slaves needed to be protected by federal power. Historians still argue whether Lincoln would have been able to successfully implement his plan for a lenient Reconstruction. His assassination left the future of the nation in the hands of a much more divided and angry government, one that would clash with his successor and lead to a long, painful, and often failed period of rebuilding. The sudden and tragic end to Lincoln's life meant that the last best hope for a quick and easy reconciliation died with him. With the war finally over, a new and immensely difficult period began. The nation was faced with a monumental task: Reconstruction. This was the process of not only physically rebuilding the South, which had been devastated by the war, but also of politically and socially reintegrating the Confederate States, and most importantly, defining the place of 4 million newly freed African Americans in American society. The challenges were immense. The South was in ruins. Its economy was shattered. Its plantations lay derelict, and its social structure, built on the institution of slavery, was gone. The first phase of Reconstruction, often called Presidential Reconstruction, was led by Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson. Johnson, a former slave owner from Tennessee, was surprisingly lenient toward the South. He pardoned most Confederate leaders and allowed the states to quickly reestablish their own governments. His policies, however, had a major flaw. They failed to protect the rights of the formerly enslaved people. In the absence of federal oversight, many Southern states passed a series of laws known as the Black Codes. These laws were designed to control the labor and behavior of black men and women. They restricted their ability to own land, to testify in court, or to even gather in groups. In many ways, the Black Codes were a continuation of slavery in all but name, a clear sign that the South was not willing to accept the reality of emancipation. This failure of presidential Reconstruction led to a clash with the Republican-controlled Congress. A group of Republicans, known as the Radical Republicans, believed that Johnson's policies were a betrayal of the Union victory and the cause of emancipation. They believed the South needed to be punished for its rebellion, and that the federal government had a moral and legal obligation to protect the rights of the freedmen. This conflict between Congress and the president would define the early years of Reconstruction. In response to the Black Codes, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted citizenship and civil rights to all male persons born in the United States, regardless of race. Johnson vetoed the bill, but Congress, with its 2/3 Republican majority, overrode his veto, a powerful statement of its resolve. They also passed the Freedmen's Bureau Act, which established an agency to help the formerly enslaved transition to a life of freedom. It provided food, housing, medical aid, and even helped establish schools. A mainstream historical fact. The Freedmen's Bureau, despite being underfunded and facing immense opposition from white Southerners, established over 1,000 schools for African Americans, a monumental step toward education and literacy for a people who had been legally forbidden from learning to read. The era of radical Reconstruction began in 1867 when Congress, tired of Johnson's obstructionism, passed a series of Reconstruction Acts. These acts divided the South into 5 military districts and placed them under military rule. To be readmitted to the Union, a state had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law and allow African American men to vote. This was a radical and unprecedented move, a clear signal that the federal government was determined to protect the rights of its new citizens. This was a time of both hope and immense struggle. For the first time in American history, African American men were able to vote and hold political office. They served as state legislators, sheriffs, and even as members of the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate. It was a brief but powerful moment of democracy and racial progress in the South. But this progress was met with a violent and determined backlash from white Southerners who were not willing to give up their power. The rise of groups like the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist organization dedicated to white supremacy and the intimidation of black voters, marked the beginning of a long and brutal campaign of violence. The clash between President Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans in Congress was not just a political battle, it was a fundamental disagreement over the very meaning of the war and its outcome. The radical Republicans, with their conviction that the South needed to be remade, used their legislative power to push through a series of constitutional amendments that would forever change the American landscape. These amendments were designed to secure the rights of the newly freed slaves and to prevent the South from simply recreating a system of racial subjugation. The first of these was the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in December 1865, just months after the end of the war. It was a simple but profound document. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. It was a clear and total abolition of slavery. It fulfilled the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation and made slavery illegal throughout the entire country. The amendment, however, did not grant citizenship or voting rights, and as we saw with the Black Codes, the South immediately sought to find ways around it. In response, Congress proposed the 14th Amendment in 1866, and it was ratified in 1868. This was arguably the most important of the Reconstruction amendments. It had several key provisions. First, it defined citizenship for the first time in the Constitution. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. This was a direct rebuke to the Dred Scott decision, which had declared that black people were not citizens. Second, it contained a crucial clause, the Equal Protection Clause, which stated that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This was a powerful tool for the federal government to ensure that states could not pass discriminatory laws. It was a revolutionary idea that gave the federal government the power to protect individual rights against state action. The third and final amendment of this era was the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870. This amendment declared that the right to vote could not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It was a groundbreaking achievement that, in theory, granted all African American men the right to vote. A mainstream historical fact. While the 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote, it did not extend this right to women of any race. This created a rift in the women's suffrage movement, as some suffragists felt that the amendment should have included women as well. The passage of these three amendments was a major legislative achievement. They were designed to be the legal foundation of a new, more equal nation. They were the fulfillment of the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, but a law on paper is not always a reality on the ground. The Southern states, forced to ratify the amendments to be readmitted to the Union, did so begrudgingly. The white power structure, stripped of its ability to legally enslave black people, now sought to find other ways to deny them their rights. This would be a long and unfortunately often successful campaign, an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of the Reconstruction amendments. Were they a flawed but crucial first step toward equality, or were they a failure as they were not consistently enforced and were eventually undermined by a series of legal and social maneuvers? It's clear that while they were a powerful legal tool, they were not enough to overcome centuries of racial prejudice and violence. The legacy of these amendments is a complex one, a story of both immense progress and disheartening setbacks. The surrender at Appomattox and the subsequent passage of the Reconstruction Amendments did not bring the story of the Civil War to a tidy close. The war had a profound and lasting legacy that reshaped every aspect of American society, from its politics to its economy and its very identity. The most obvious and immediate consequence was the preservation of the Union. The conflict had settled once and for all the question of whether a state could legally leave the United States. It affirmed the power of the federal government over that of the individual states and established that the United States was a single, indivisible nation. The second, and arguably most important legacy, was the abolition of slavery. The war, which began as a fight to preserve the Union, evolved into a war of liberation. The 13th Amendment enshrined this victory, but the social and economic changes that followed were immense. 4 million formerly enslaved people who were a central part of the Southern economy were now free. This created a profound social upheaval. The old plantation system, which had defined the South for centuries, was gone. The transition from a slave-based economy to a free labor one was incredibly difficult and often fraught with conflict. The war also had a transformative effect on the national economy. The North, with its industrial base, had a clear advantage throughout the conflict. The war accelerated industrialization and technological innovation. The demand for war materials, from uniforms to rifles, spurred the growth of factories and railroads. The federal government, during the war, passed several key pieces of legislation that helped shape the modern American economy, including the National Banking Act, which created a uniform national currency, and the Homestead Act, which encouraged westward expansion. The human cost was staggering. The Civil War was, by far, the deadliest conflict in American history. Over 620,000 soldiers died, a number that surpasses the combined American deaths in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. The scale of the death and suffering was unprecedented. It left an entire generation with physical and psychological wounds that would never fully heal. It also left tens of thousands of widows and orphans, a burden that the government had to figure out how to handle. The sheer scale of the death, a grim historical fact, is one of the most sobering aspects of the conflict's legacy. The war also fundamentally changed the role of the federal government. Before the war, the government was a relatively small, unobtrusive entity. During the war, it expanded its powers immensely, from raising a massive army to levying a national income tax for the first time. This expansion of federal power was a crucial turning point, setting a precedent for a more active and powerful central government that would continue to grow throughout the 20th century. An open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the true cost and benefits of the Civil War. Was the preservation of the Union worth the immense human cost? Could slavery have been ended without a bloody war? These are questions that will likely never be fully answered, but they speak to the deep and complex moral and ethical issues at the heart of the conflict. The political and social legacy was just as profound. The Republican Party, once a small sectional party, emerged from the war as the dominant political force in the nation. The Democratic Party, associated with the war's failures and the Southern Rebellion, was relegated to a minority role for decades. The war also left a bitter, enduring memory in the South, a sense of grievance that would be expressed in the decades that followed through a powerful and romanticized narrative known as the Lost Cause, which we'll discuss next. In the decades that followed the Civil War, the South was faced with the monumental task of coming to terms with its defeat. To many white Southerners, the economic ruin and social upheaval were too much to bear. To cope with the psychological weight of their loss and to maintain a sense of honor and cultural identity, they began to create a romanticized and revisionist narrative of the war. This narrative became known as the Lost Cause. It was a powerful and enduring mythology that would shape Southern identity and race relations for a century. The central tenets of the Lost Cause were simple but effective. First, it argued that the war was not fought over slavery, but over states' rights and a noble defense of the Southern way of life. Proponents of the Lost Cause downplayed the role of slavery, often referring to it as a benevolent institution and portraying the formerly enslaved people as content and loyal to their masters. This claim is, of course, entirely false, as the very documents of secession from the Southern states themselves explicitly list the preservation of slavery as the primary reason for leaving the Union. Second, the Lost Cause mythology argued that the Confederacy was only defeated because of the North's overwhelming numerical and industrial superiority, not because of any military or moral failing. It portrayed the Confederate generals, particularly Robert E. Lee, as heroic and brilliant figures, almost Christ-like martyrs who fought a good fight against impossible odds. Stonewall Jackson was, in this narrative, a military genius of the highest order. The common Confederate soldier was depicted as a brave and noble gentleman, a hero who fought for his home and his honor. This idealized image of the Southern soldier became a central part of the Southern identity. Third, the Lost Cause narrative sought to justify the post-war social and racial order. It portrayed Reconstruction as a period of Northern tyranny, a time when corrupt carpetbaggers and scalawags from the North and black politicians took advantage of the defeated South. The violence of groups like the Ku Klux Klan was often whitewashed or ignored, and the fight to regain political power was seen as a second, heroic struggle for self-determination. An open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the origins and purpose of the lost cause. Was it a sincere attempt to mourn a lost way of life, or was it a cynical and intentional effort to justify racial segregation and white supremacy? It's likely that it was a combination of both. The narrative was spread through memoirs, novels, and historical societies, and it was eventually enshrined in public monuments and textbooks. It provided a sense of solace and pride to a defeated people, but it did so at the cost of historical truth. The enduring influence of the lost cause can be seen today in the debates over Confederate monuments and the flying of the Confederate flag. For many, these symbols are a way to honor their ancestors and their heritage. For others, they are symbols of slavery, treason, and a painful legacy of racial oppression. A mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of Confederate monuments were erected not in the immediate aftermath of the war, but during the early 20th century, a time when the Jim Crow segregation laws were being solidified throughout the South. This timing strongly suggests that the monuments were not just about honoring the dead, but about celebrating a racial hierarchy. The lost cause was a powerful narrative that allowed the South to psychologically distance itself from its defeat and to maintain a sense of honor and racial superiority. It was an alternative history that shaped the way generations of Americans, both North and South, understood the Civil War. It was a narrative that allowed the South to lose the war on the battlefield, but to win it, in a sense, in the history books for a very long time. The Civil War, a conflict that ended in the 19th century, continues to live on in the public imagination, often through the lens of popular culture and public memory. Its portrayal in film, literature, and monuments has shaped how generations of Americans understand the war, and it has often served as a battleground for competing narratives. The stories we tell about the war are just as important as the historical facts themselves. Early 20th century portrayals of the war were often heavily influenced by the lost cause narrative. A prime example is the immensely popular 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation. This silent film, which was a box office sensation and even shown at the White House, portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroic saviors of the South from a corrupt Reconstruction government and a barbaric black population. The film's immense popularity cemented a racist and historically inaccurate view of the war and Reconstruction in the minds of millions of Americans for decades. A more nuanced, though still romanticized view of the war came with the 1939 film Gone with the Wind. While not as overtly racist as The Birth of a Nation, it still portrayed the antebellum South as a beautiful, idyllic society, and the war as a tragic loss of a noble way of life. The film's sweeping romance and epic scale made it a classic, but it also reinforced the idea that the war was not primarily about slavery. In the late 20th century, a new wave of films and books sought to provide a more historically accurate and complex portrayal of the war. Ken Burns's 1990 documentary series, The Civil War, was a watershed moment. It reached a massive audience and, for many, was their primary source of information about the conflict. The series' use of period photographs, letters, and a thoughtful narrative provided a more sober and honest look at the war, its causes, and its consequences. It was a powerful counter-narrative to the romanticized versions that had come before. The film Glory, 1989, which depicted the story of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, brought the bravery and contributions of African American soldiers to a mainstream audience for the first time. The film's powerful imagery and its honest portrayal of the racism faced by black soldiers, both North and South, helped to correct a long-standing omission in the public's understanding of the conflict. A mainstream historical fact, the film Glory was a major success and helped to spur a renewed interest in the history of African Americans in the Civil War, leading to more scholarly research and public attention to the topic. The war also lives on in the form of monuments and historical sites. The battlefields, from Gettysburg to Vicksburg, are now preserved as national parks, places where visitors can walk the ground where history was made. But the monuments that dot the landscape, particularly in the South, are a source of ongoing controversy. Many of these monuments, as we discussed, were erected decades after the war and are seen by some as symbols of white supremacy and by others as a way to honor their heritage. The debate over these monuments is a powerful reminder that the Civil War is not just a historical event. It is a living part of American culture and politics. An open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the purpose of preserving certain historical sites and monuments. Should we leave them as they are, as a reminder of our nation's complicated past, or should they be removed as symbols of a hateful ideology? There is no easy answer, and the debate reflects the deep divisions that still exist in the country. The Civil War, through these various forms of public memory, continues to shape our national identity. It's a reminder of a time when the nation nearly tore itself apart, and its enduring legacy is a constant call to examine who we are, where we came from, and where we are going. The long, bloody saga of the American Civil War, from the first shots at Fort Sumter to the final surrenders, is more than just a list of battles and dates. It's a fundamental story about the American experiment itself, a story of a nation grappling with its most profound contradictions. What lessons can we, a people living a century and a half later, draw from this immense conflict? The first, and perhaps most enduring, is that of the immense, terrible cost of division. The war was the culmination of decades of political failure, of a society so fractured by its core values that it could no longer find a way to peacefully coexist. The lesson is a somber reminder that when common ground is lost, and when people on different sides see each other not as fellow citizens, but as enemies, the consequences can be catastrophic. A second lesson is that of the enduring struggle for liberty and equality. The war began with the limited goal of preserving the Union, but it was irrevocably transformed into a fight to end slavery. The stories of the formerly enslaved people who fought for their own freedom, who flocked to the Union Army, and who struggled to build new lives after the war, are a powerful testament to the idea that the promise of America, though often unfulfilled, is still a powerful force. The Civil War was a painful but ultimately necessary step toward a more inclusive and just society. It forced the nation to confront the central hypocrisy of its founding ideals that a nation built on liberty could also be a nation of slaves. An open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the moral trajectory of the war. Was the Union's eventual fight for emancipation a result of a true moral awakening, or was it a pragmatic military and political decision? The reality is that it was likely a complex mix of both, a reminder that even the most profound historical changes often have messy and complicated origins. The final lesson is one of reconciliation and memory. The way the nation healed, or failed to heal, after the war is a cautionary tale. The generous terms of surrender at Appomattox and the initial attempts at a peaceful reconstruction showed a path toward a more compassionate reunion. But the failure of Reconstruction and the rise of the lost cause narrative show how quickly a nation can revert to its old habits and prejudices. The struggle to accurately and honestly remember the war continues to this day, a battle over what monuments should stand, what flags should fly, and what we should teach our children. This ongoing debate is a clear sign that the war's legacy is not a settled matter. And so, the story of the American Civil War sinks into a gentle hum of memory, a long and complicated tale of a country that fought with itself, tore itself apart, and then slowly, painstakingly, began to put itself back together again. The sounds of the cannons fade now, replaced by the soft whisper of the wind through the tall grasses of the battlefield. The soldiers, the generals, the presidents, they have all gone to sleep. Their stories are a part of the past now, a part of the long, slow, quiet journey of our history. And so, their stories sink into legend, and a nation, though changed forever, found a way to become one again. And so ended the story of a forgotten time. End of script. Sweet dreams.